Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into one of the most persistent and emotionally charged tensions within boys' love, or BL, narratives, the continued and often debated presence of tragic or bittersweet endings. This is a genre that, it sprang largely from fantasy and emotional escape, yet it inherited a really complicated, sometimes painful legacy from broader queer storytelling traditions.
And that inheritance is precisely the flashpoint, right? The core question for creators and audiences alike is, I think, pretty critical. In the modern landscape of global BL, is the reliance on tragic outcomes still a necessary act of remembrance, something that ensures historical gravity and emotional realism are recognized? Or does it now risk reinforcing the suffering narrative, potentially exhausting the very audience it's supposed to comfort?
I stake my position on narrative responsibility. I'm going to argue that thoughtfully executed tragic BLs are, they're vital instruments. They honor the profound complexity of queer history, reminding us that love can be deeply meaningful and validating even when societal, biological, or systemic forces inevitably prevent its survival. To excise tragedy entirely is effectively, it's to sanitize that difficult historical reality.
And I come at it from a different way. While fully acknowledge the historical context that necessitated tragic storytelling, I contend that for contemporary audiences, particularly those dealing with emotional exhaustion from decades of seeing themselves punished on screen, these endings reinforce a damaging idea that queer devotion has to suffer to achieve narrative depth. We really need to prioritize the genre's function as a refuge now, rather than just perpetuating pain reinforcement.
Okay, so let's ground this in historical context immediately. My perspective is tied directly to the undeniable realities of queer life before and during major societal shifts. We're talking about lives marked by criminalization, by forced invisibility, the brutal reality of censorship, and the crushing collective weight of the AIDS crisis.
Right, and those markers of loss are absolutely undeniable. But when we look at contemporary BL, we have to ask if the genre must perpetually carry that specific historical burden. The cultural moment has shifted dramatically, not just in terms of societal acceptance in some regions, but in audience demand. For younger queer viewers, especially Gen Z, who are, less tethered to the trauma narratives of the 80s and 90s, the repetition of tragedy moves beyond remembrance and into just emotional exhaustion.
But tragedies aren't inherently punitive. They can be profound acts of remembrance. For many viewers, and I'm thinking particularly of older queer audiences or those living in less accepting regions, these stories validate precisely because they validate lived experiences of loving under duress, of forced secrecy, of losing partners to factors entirely outside of their control. Tragedy offers catharsis by validating the difficulty of that love, instead of just ignoring the cost.
I see why you think that catharsis is necessary, but I'm not convinced by the implication that suffering is the only path to validation. When tragedy persists in this volume, it risks reinforcing a damaging narrative, this subconscious idea that queer love is inherently fragile, temporary, or fundamentally doomed. It often feels like emotional punishment disguised as realism. And we need to talk about the artistic hierarchy inherent here. Tragic endings are frequently treated by critics and producers as more artistic, serious, or mature.
That is a legitimate critique of the cynical exploitation of trauma, yes. But I don't think it negates the power of the form itself when it's done well.
But the subtle existence of that hierarchy suggests that queer joy, simple, achieved happiness, is somehow less meaningful than queer suffering. If a happy ending is dismissed as shallow fan service, we are perpetuating the idea that the only path to genuine, critically recognized depth is through the death or destruction of the relationship. This brings us back to the fundamental contract BL makes with its audience.
That's a good pivot, because I believe your understanding of that contract is too narrow. You frame BL as purely a genre of refuge, a sanctuary.
Precisely. Historically, and certainly in its formative years, BL emerged specifically as a space of emotional fantasy focused intensely on intimacy and emotional safety. It was designed to explore emotional bonds divorced from reproductive or societal expectations.
So when BL adopts tragedy, it imports external suffering into a narrative space designed for comfort. This fundamentally risks betraying the audience's expectation of refuge.
I see why you think that, though I would frame it differently. If BL only ever offers pure, unadulterated fantasy and refuge, it risks becoming intellectually superficial and ultimately detached from genuine human emotional texture. Tragedy creates depth because it acknowledges that love, it does not exist in a sterile vacuum. It is always subjected to the pressures of societal change, timing, and internal conflict.
It's not about avoiding all conflict, though. It's about avoiding the annihilation of the relationship as the default mechanism for generating depth.
My point is that the refusal to lie about reality, the acknowledgement that external forces can and historically did destroy beautiful love, that makes the love story feel profound and earned, not just comfortable. The genre must offer critical reflection on reality, not just pure escapism. If the only reflection we permit is a happy one, we are performing a kind of narrative censorship in the name of comfort.
But for an audience that already lives with those external forces, the reality is inescapable for them. Why must the narrative consistently remind them of the most devastating outcomes? The initial appeal of BL was to explore feeling and intimacy, not necessarily to educate society on suffering. If the primary feeling it explores is profound grief, over and over, that is a pattern of emotional taxation, not simple reflection.
That pattern of taxation brings us to the second core point, the efficacy and the ethics of repetitive suffering. My argument rests on differentiating between intentional tragedy and cynical repetition. When loss is purposeful, intentional, and deeply integrated into the character's journey, when it truly reflects a difficult truth, it serves a vital function, preventing the erasure of difficult historical truths.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the majority of modern tragic endings serve that vital grounding function anymore. Audience fatigue, especially among younger viewers across different media platforms, is an ethical factor that creators must prioritize. When tragedy becomes repetitive, especially when it relies on tropes like the sudden, unexplained fatal illness, it loses its profound impact and starts feeling obligatory, or what I would call aestheticized.
Okay, define aestheticized suffering for us in this context.
Aestheticized suffering is the practice of using trauma or loss purely for visual impact, for narrative shock value, or just for the sake of appearing serious, often completely detached from genuine character development or meaningful societal critique. It becomes a shorthand for depth. We see it manifest when queer characters suffer the most dramatic, yet least earned fates, simply because the writer believes death grants the story artistic merit.
I agree completely that exploitation is poor storytelling. But that doesn't mean the only alternative is mandatory happiness. When you look at regional differences, say, the more mature, somber approach often favored in Japanese BL versus the generally more optimistic, mass-market Thai productions, you see different cultural conversations about the role of suffering. The Japanese approach often seeks that somber reflection. Are we saying that entire body of work is simply aestheticized punishment?
Not entirely, no, but the global market sets expectations. When Gen Z viewers who have higher emotional fluency regarding on-screen representation and a demand for radical joy are constantly fed tragedy, they inevitably begin to question why queer characters must still suffer to be deemed worthy of serious narrative consideration. It's the sheer volume of destruction that shifts the conversation from reflective necessity to just a draining obligation.
But doesn't avoiding difficult outcomes sanitize the historical gravity we discussed? If we only permit joyful, achievable, or perfect outcomes, are we truly reflecting the complexity of life? Or are we just catering to a demand for unchallenging comfort? The most powerful tragic narratives are those that show us the depth of the love precisely through the devastation of the loss. It underscores the value of what was taken.
I argue the narrative burden is now disproportionate. The genre has evolved to the point where depth should be achieved through complexity, political maneuvering, deep emotional betrayal, social alienation, not just through death. For many, that constant expectation of death feels like a betrayal of the promise of the genre, which was initially to offer a space where those outside pressures were secondary to the intimacy between the characters.
That push for complexity naturally brings us to the common gray space, the nuanced, bittersweet middle ground. Stories that involve separation without death, or love that cannot continue due to circumstances beyond individual control. This is the attempt to acknowledge pain without fully committing to narrative annihilation.
And I believe this middle ground, the bittersweet ending, is perhaps the most emotionally responsible direction for modern BL. Bittersweet endings acknowledge that queer love is often deeply challenged and painful, but they avoid the nihilistic outcome of complete destruction. They allow the viewer to grieve circumstances like timing, societal barriers, or economic necessity while still honoring the depth and validity of the love that existed.
I see the appeal of that emotional compromise. A bittersweet ending suggests that queer love itself didn't fail, only the external circumstances did.
Exactly. It doesn't deny suffering, but it also doesn't demand as a prerequisite for a narrative climax. This balance, in my view, represents a sophisticated and sustainable future for the genre, prioritizing healing alongside complexity.
That's a compelling argument for emotional responsibility. But I have to question whether the avoidance of true, devastating tragedy sometimes minimizes the gravity of historical loss. The bittersweet ending, while gentler and safer, might fall short of the profound catharsis achieved by stories that fully commit to reflecting life's devastating outcomes.
You are speaking to catharsis achieved through the Greek model of tragedy, purgation through suffering. I am suggesting that for an audience segment that has been historically subject to that suffering, catharsis can now be achieved through resolution and validation, not just through final loss. The bittersweet allows for hope to coexist with grief. We shouldn't confuse gentleness with shallowness.
Yet, in the context of remembrance, a separation due to, say, career choices is heartbreaking, but losing a partner to forced institutionalization or the violence of a hate crime is a fundamentally different, historically resonant experience. If we only show the former, are we erasing the latter from our narrative consciousness?
I think we're choosing to shift the focus from the impossibility of queer love to the challenges of sustaining it. The gravity of historical loss must be addressed, but perhaps through other narratives, through documentary or through period pieces. But when we look at contemporary BL, which is often framed outside those strict historical constraints, maintaining the pattern of tragedy is a conscious choice to prioritize pain regardless of the availability of complexity.
Ultimately, both narrative forms hold different necessary truths. The question for creators must always be, which truth does this specific story need to deliver, and which truth does this specific audience need to hear right now?
Precisely. It's a tension between respect for the past and responsibility to the present.
So, as we conclude, I maintain that tragedy, when it's executed thoughtfully, meticulously, and with historical grounding, it remains a vital storytelling tool within BL. It ensures that profound societal and personal losses are neither forgotten nor diminished. It offers a catharsis rooted in validation that a simple, conflict-free fantasy just can't possibly deliver. The pursuit of historical gravity necessitates the allowance for devastating outcomes.
And I reaffirm that while the history of loss must absolutely be remembered, the continuous narrative burden of tragedy is now disproportionate and often counterproductive. The genre has evolved to a point where the most radical act creators can offer is conscious choice, choosing complexity and durable joy over the easier expected path of suffering. Depth is not exclusive to death, and the goal must be to acknowledge pain without making it a prerequisite for serious, engaging queer storytelling.
I think we both agree fundamentally that the ideal future of BL is one that recognizes that depth and happiness are not mutually exclusive. The genre can and should hold both grief and joy in the same frame, provided that the narrative choice is conscious, intentional, and rigorously examined.
The core tension remains the defining feature of the genre today. That balance between honoring the profound history of suffering that defined queer life for centuries and prioritizing the emotional needs and desire for genuine refuge felt by the contemporary, emotionally saturated audience. That difficult balance is where the future of BL storytelling lies.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.